Right, so Israel's first attempt to distribute aid in Gaza under the guise of the supposed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF, has not only been a total logistical failure and a calculated act of cruelty, but fatally so into the bargain. Israel's managed to take what it hoped would be a PR exercise in showing they are delivering aid to innocent Palestinians and turned it into an image of reinforcing all of the apartheid conditions they're known for, and gone, look, we are helping them, and assumed the world would be pleased and not further horrified. However, scenes have emerged resembling the darkest chapters of modern history in association with that, with lines of starving civilians penned into what look like queues from above, but are instead essentially wire cages, hemmed in like livestock. And as Israel managed to screw up the aid handouts in Rafah, the bullets were soon flying, and the mercenaries hired to oversee the aid distribution fled. Israel sought to weaponize aid distribution when they themselves have been the source of the starvation, and they failed on humanitarian terms, yet again figuring they can propagandize their way out of the corner they are in. But they've instead made matters massively worse for themselves, as the people of Gaza continue to suffer. Right, so for months now, on top of the 20 months of genocide, Gaza have been suffering under an Israeli-imposed blockade that has pushed the civilian population to the brink of famine. Medical infrastructure has collapsed, clean water is scarce, 2 million people have been displaced, often more than once. Israel, facing increasing international criticism over its military actions in Rafah and elsewhere, seized the opportunity to attempt an aid distribution campaign that could maybe polish its image abroad, though it was all being done as a supposed US aid exercise. Therefore, enter the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF, supposedly US-backed, but it all soon turned out to be an Israel-approved NGO that we were meant to believe would deliver critical relief to Palestinians, all from the very entity that put them in that crisis to begin with. Yeah, okay. Rather than supporting or coordinating with long-standing humanitarian bodies, though, the GHF has established 4 distribution centres, 3 of them in South Gaza, 1 in Central Gaza, and none in the north, effectively excluding thousands of Palestinians unless they displace themselves southwards once more in order to access it. The aid rollout began with chilling optics, though, and this is the image that has done the rounds on social media that's chilled people to the bone when they saw it, rapidly eliciting comparisons with scenes from World War II, literal concentration camps in full colour, echoing old black and white scenes that were supposed to be never again moments. Photos and videos circulating showing starving Gazans looking like they are queuing, but were instead crowded into what amounted to metal cages, herded through biometric scanning checkpoints and made to wait under the watch of Israeli drones and US-hired mercenaries. And then, of course, it all went wrong, and then came the violence. As desperation peaked, chaos erupted at the Rafah distribution centre, with aid being handed out far too slowly to meet the needs of the massive crowds, many of whom had not eaten properly in weeks. Some Palestinians attempted to push through those fences. In response, the IDF opened fire. It really is their go-to response far too often, isn't it? At least 6 people have been killed and 47 injured in the chaos. The armed contractors hired to oversee security fled the scene. They abandoned the site and left behind the traumatised survivors. According to a report by Al Jazeera, the crowd surge was predictable and entirely avoidable. Humanitarian organisations had warned that such limited aid, combined with excessive delays and lack of crowd control expertise, would trigger a disaster. But those warnings went unheeded, and I doubt few of us are surprised by that, when this was more about optics than ever delivering aid. The launch of the GHF, as I covered in another recent video, coincided with the resignation of its CEO, Jake Wood, who said the model chosen to distribute aid couldn't be done without committing crimes against humanity, and he refused to be party to that. Simultaneously, legal watchdog and fellow Swiss NGO Trial International filed a case against GHF in Switzerland, accusing it of complicity in war crimes by enabling Israel's use of humanitarian aid for population control and propaganda. Yet despite both of these early setbacks, the aid distribution attempt went ahead regardless, to a calamitous conclusion. Disturbingly, reports have also now surfaced suggesting ties between GHF and Mossad, Israel's notorious foreign intelligence agency, and while the details remain a bit murky on that front, 2 former Israeli ministers have hinted at intelligence agency involvement, raising serious concerns about whether the aid effort is being used as a surveillance operation as well, under the guise of charity, not just of the Gazan people, but more widely of other organisations still trying to operate and genuinely help. Furthermore, an investigation into the contents of the aid boxes revealed that nearly all the food and medical supplies were Israeli-made products, allowing Israel not just to control the flow of goods, but also profit from the very suffering it helped create. Humanitarian aid, such as it was, and despite the stockpiles of aid that have built up outside the walls of Gaza and Israel, has been used to benefit Israel's own economy by only using Israeli goods. As bad as all this was, the gaslighting going on social media in light of that image of the caged queues was sickening. It's easy to look at that image as taken by drone overhead and think, well, it's just a queue, isn't it? Because that is what it looks like ostensibly. But there's no way forward because there's barriers there. And going back for these people, it's just not an option, is it? I've read comments saying, it's just an ordinary line. It's orderly. It's calm. What's wrong with that? Well, it is still, isn't it? When it descended into chaos and 6 people lost their lives, though, it's a little bit of a crass comment, to say the very least. I've seen people compare it to queuing for a concert. I've seen people compare it to, it's like the lift lines at a ski resort, to waiting at a bus stop as well, as others have mentioned. But you don't get biometrically scanned at those. You don't have guns pointed at you whilst you're queuing normally, do you? You aren't threatened with military assault in a line at the supermarket, are you? In any of those instances. And quite how disturbing some people can still be has enraged still more people who aren't nearly as vapid. One of the most telling moments of the Rafah disaster came not from the IDF, but from the private security firms, those mercenaries who were hired to oversee the aid distribution. When gunfire erupted and the situation spiralled out of control, they simply fled. This sudden withdrawal underscored both the volatility of the situation and just the sheer lack of preparation too. Private military contractors, motivated by profit to be there, apparently being paid around $1,000 a day, are typically willing to endure high-risk zones, but their abrupt exit revealed that even they recognise the operation is completely unsalvageable and out of control. Their absence left behind unarmed civilians caught up between desperation and Israeli bullets. Reactions from international communities have ranged from horror to furious condemnation. The European Union called for a formal investigation into those events at Rafah and urged Israel to hand over aid distribution to competent, independent humanitarian agencies. Several EU parliamentarians went further, demanding sanctions and suspension of the EU-Israel Association Agreement, citing flagrant violations of human rights. The Foundation for Defense of Democracy, the FDD, a US right-wing think tank often very sympathetic to Israeli policy, whilst stamping all over Iranian policy at the same time, they're one of those, also attempted to frame the GHF initiative as a way to weather international criticism and not a legitimate aid effort. Yet this framing ends up confirming the entire critique, doesn't it? That the aid operation was more about optics than ever alleviating suffering. It's Israeli propaganda once again. Meanwhile, Gaza's media office issued a particularly powerful and excoriating statement. The Israeli occupation has utterly failed in its project to distribute aid in the racist buffer zones amid the collapse of the humanitarian pathway and escalation of the crime of starvation. We affirm that the Israeli occupation's project to distribute aid in so-called buffer zones has completely failed, as confirmed by field reports and even acknowledged by Hebrew media. Thousands of starving people who have been besieged and denied food and medicine by the occupation for nearly 90 days rushed into these zones in a heartbreaking and tragic scene. The situation ended with the storming of distribution centres and the seizing of food under the pressure of deadly hunger, prompting the occupation forces to open fire and injure several civilians. This clearly reflects the total collapse of the humanitarian path that the occupation falsely claims to uphold. What happened today is undeniable proof of the occupation's failure to manage the humanitarian crisis it has deliberately created through policies of starvation, blockade and bombing. It constitutes a continuation of a full-fledged genocide under international law, especially Article 2 of the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Moreover, the establishment of isolated ghettos for the distribution of limited aid amid danger of death, bullets and starvation does not reflect any genuine intent to resolve the crisis. Instead, it represents a systematic political engineering aimed at sustaining starvation, dismantling Palestinian society and imposing politicised humanitarian pathways that serve the occupation's military and security agendas. Based on this catastrophic failure, we affirm the following. First, we hold the Israeli occupation fully responsible, legally and morally, for the state of the food collapse in Gaza. We condemn its use of aid as a weapon of war and a tool of political blackmail, and its ongoing obstruction of relief entry through official crossings and international humanitarian organisations. Second, we call on the United Nations and the Security Council to take immediate and effective action to halt this crime, urgently opening the crossings without restriction and enabling humanitarian organisations to carry out their duties independently of the occupation and its agendas. Third, we demand the dispatch of independent international investigation committees to document the crime of starvation and prosecute Israeli leaders for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Fourth, we appeal to Arab and Islamic nations and to all free countries of the world to intervene immediately and activate independent and safe humanitarian channels that break the siege and prevent the occupation from continuing to use food as a vile weapon in its genocidal war. Fifth, we categorically reject any project that relies on buffer zones or humanitarian corridors under the supervision of the Israeli occupation, the very entity starving, killing and exterminating civilians. We consider such zones a modern version of racist ghettos that deepen isolation and genocide rather than save lives. What is happening in Gaza is a major crime unfolding before the eyes of the world, and silence is a clear act of complicity. We will continue to sound the alarm in the name of our great Palestinian people and hold the occupation, along with its backers, led by the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany and France, fully responsible for the ongoing famine and mass slaughter of civilians in the Gaza Strip. Far from being a neutral humanitarian mission, the GHF initiative appears engineered to deepen division, exacerbate suffering and shift demographics. International law forbids the use of starvation as a weapon of war, but it's happening. By tightly controlling aid flows, creating logistical bottlenecks, and then misrepresenting those efforts in the media, Israel is engaging in a slow, painful siege that violates every principle of humanitarian conduct. Even under the most generous interpretation, this aid operation is a grotesque failure. Under a more critical and evidence-based lens, it becomes an act of collective punishment in and of itself. Only Israel could possibly turn aid distribution into a war crime, surely. Statements and condemnation are one thing, though, but the world must respond with more than that now, as that statement from the Gaza Media Office asked for, because these people are still being starved as aid claims to be arriving. And this excerpt from Dropsite News spells that point out further. Well, the US State Department announced that 8,000 food boxes, equal to 462,000 meals, were distributed on Tuesday through the US-Israeli Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Gaza Humanitarian Coordinator Ayad Amawi told Dropsite News that only 7 trucks arrived, barely enough for a single camp. 8,000 food boxes would require more than 7 trucks to deliver, he said. Amawi called the effort symbolic and superficial, adding that Gaza needs at least 600 aid trucks daily to meet the needs of over 2 million people. Palestinians caged like animals by private US military contractors in Gaza, the Israeli-endorsed Gaza aid system that the US and Israeli investors have pushed in a drive to privatize aid during a genocide and to contribute to an ethnic cleansing plan, entails using private military contractors who force Palestinians into cages to line up for the bare minimum amount of food required to survive. Privatizing a genocide and the claimed aid that Israel say has been delivered cannot, from a logistical perspective, possibly be true. The GHF's activities should be shut down immediately. Aid must be placed in the hands of neutral, experienced actors like the United Nations via UNRWA and the Red Crescent to deliver, because they know what they're doing. Israel must be held accountable for using starvation as a weapon and using it as a propaganda tool alongside it now. And the global public must refuse to be complicit in a system where food and water become instruments of war. What we witnessed in Gaza was not a relief effort, it was a grotesque performance where mercy was mimicked, dignity was crushed, and the only winners were those who are literally profiting right now from all of this pain. And with all the aid that Israel are failing to deliver, though, comes to claims that to let anyone else deliver aid is to let Hamas steal it. Well, that claim just got blown apart utterly, and you won't believe which US establishment figure did so at that. So do check out this video recommendation as your suggested next watch for more on that story. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the very same time, which is massively appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people as I do, and I will hopefully catch you on the next video. Cheers, folks.